The cruelest words are never shouted. They are whispered close to the ear, dressed in cologne and champagne, delivered with a smile so the wound bleeds quietly. Preston Kane leaned toward Hazel Whitmore that night with the poise of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of humiliation. He called her fat. He called her embarrassing. He told her the dress she wore was crying for help. He did not know that 3 tables away, a man with obsidian cufflinks and a scar along his jaw had heard every syllable. He did not know that man was Dario Castellano. And he did not know that within 48 hours, everything Preston had ever built would collapse into ash beneath a pair of handmade Italian shoes. The Ashford room sat on the 42nd floor of a limestone tower in Boston's Beacon Hill, and it smelled of aged bourbon, imported white roses, and the quiet arrogance of old money. Reservations required a 12-month wait and a personal reference from an existing member. The tasting menu started at $800 a plate. The wine list read like a museum catalog. The waitstaff moved in soft-soled shoes across imported walnut floors, and the jazz quartet in the corner played standards so gently the notes seemed to drift rather than sound. It was the kind of place where a woman like Hazel Whitmore was not supposed to exist. Not because she was unwelcome, because she had learned over 29 years to believe that rooms like this were built for other women. Thinner women, louder women, women who did not apologize for the space they occupied. Hazel stood near the tall arched window overlooking the Charles River, clutching a glass of untouched Sancerre. She was 5'6" and 220 pounds, and every one of those pounds felt like it was being measured by the eyes around her. She wore a borrowed navy cocktail dress from her older sister, a size too small across the hips, and she had spent 40 minutes in the powder room adjusting it before she gathered the courage to step onto the main floor. Her chestnut hair was pinned into a low twist at the nape of her neck. Her warm brown eyes carried the tired kindness of a woman who had spent her whole life being told to smile more, eat less, take up less room. She was here because her firm, Halloway and Reed Architecture, had required her attendance at the client appreciation dinner. She was here because saying no would have cost her the promotion she had been quietly bleeding for. She was here because rent in Cambridge did not pay itself, and neither did the medical bills piling up at Mass General for her father, a retired literature professor named Charles Whitmore, whose hands had begun trembling 18 months ago and had not stopped since. Parkinson's had a way of stealing a man in slow, cruel installments. Every month, the treatments cost more. Every month, Hazel wired money home to Vermont and skipped another meal she could not afford. She had learned to survive on cheap coffee, granola bars, and the private grief of a daughter watching her father forget how to hold a pen. What no one in the Ashford room knew, what she had never told a single colleague at her firm, was that Hazel Whitmore was not merely a junior architect from Vermont. Her mother, Elena Whitmore, had been a concert pianist trained at the conservatory in Florence, and Hazel had spent every childhood summer in a stone villa outside the city with her grandmother Nonna Beatrice, a woman who spoke no English and refused to let Hazel speak any either. By the time Hazel was 15, she dreamed in Italian. She read Dante in the original. She could tell a Florentine accent from a Roman one at 10 paces. She hid all of it now, because in the world she inhabited, being clever only invited more scrutiny of the body that carried the cleverness. Better to be quiet, better to be small, better to survive. She was staring into her wine, rehearsing an exit, when she felt him before she saw him. Preston. He crossed the room with the easy stride of a man who had recently made partner at Whitfield Barrington, one of the mid-tier investment firms that fed off Boston's old money. His tuxedo was tailored within an inch of its life. His jaw was freshly clean-shaven, and on his arm was Sienna, the fitness influencer he had left Hazel for 8 months earlier. Sienna had 200,000 Instagram followers, a waist the circumference of a wine bottle, and the smile of a woman who had been told her whole life that her face was her fortune. She was laughing at something Preston had just said, and her eyes were already fixed on Hazel with the unmistakable gleam of a predator scenting weakness. Hazel. Preston's voice landed with the warmth of a wet coin. I didn't know they let architects into rooms like this. She turned. She kept her face still. She had learned, over 3 years of dating him and 8 months of grieving him, that any reaction was a gift he did not deserve. Preston. Sienna. Enjoy your evening. She tried to step past him. He shifted, blocking her path with the casual cruelty of a man who had done it 1,000 times before. His eyes traveled down her body slowly, deliberately, the way a butcher inspects meat. That dress, he said, and let the words hang. Wow, really brave of you. Is that the same one you wore to my sister's engagement party? Because I have to say, it fit differently then. Sienna covered her giggle with a manicured hand. A woman at the next table glanced over and quickly looked away. Hazel's mouth went dry. She could feel the heat crawling up her throat, could feel the burn behind her eyes, and she hated herself for it. She was 29 years old. She was a licensed architect. She had designed a public library extension in Somerville that had been featured in Boston Home magazine. She was not a child. She was not the woman who used to cry in the shower after Preston told her she needed to try harder at the gym. And yet, standing in this borrowed dress in this glittering room, she was exactly that woman again. If you have ever been made to feel small by someone who was never big enough to hold you, you already know the taste of this moment. Do me a favor before this story goes any further. Hit that like button and let the algorithm know Hazel deserves what comes next. Because trust me, what comes next is going to be worth every second. Preston, please. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I'm here for work. Let me pass. He leaned in closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, the same one she had bought him for his 30th birthday, the same bottle he had clearly never thrown out. His voice dropped to that intimate register he used to reserve for pillow talk, and now used only for cruelty. God, Hazel, you've really let yourself go. What are you now, a size 18? 20? I can practically hear that dress crying for help. It's honestly embarrassing to be seen near you. I did you a favor leaving. Sienna's been trying to figure out what I ever saw in you, and honestly, standing here right now, I can't remember either. The room did not stop. The jazz quartet kept playing. The waiters kept gliding. Two women at a nearby table who had heard every word suddenly became very interested in their salads. And Hazel Whitmore, who had rehearsed 1,000 comebacks in the shower, in her car, in the endless dark hours before sleep, could not summon a single one. Her ears rang. Her hands trembled around the stem of her wine glass. One tear escaped and traced a hot, humiliating line down her cheek before she could stop it. 3 tables away, near the tall window overlooking the river, a man set down his silver fork with deliberate precision. Dario Castellano was 36 years old, and he had spent the last decade being feared by men far more powerful than Preston Kane. He was the head of the Castellano family, which officially controlled a chain of high-end Italian restaurants across New England and a shipping concern that moved legitimate goods through the port of Boston. Unofficially, the Castellanos controlled a great deal more, and no one who valued their livelihood asked questions about it. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that had been cut for him in Milan. His cufflinks were carved obsidian. A faint scar ran along the left side of his jaw, a souvenir from a night in Naples he did not discuss. His dark eyes had been described, by a rival who did not live long enough to repeat the description, as the color of a lake at midnight. He had come to the Ashford room alone tonight, apart from Marco and Luca, the 2 men who flanked him at all times and were currently seated at a smaller table near the entrance, watching everything and pretending to watch nothing. Dario had been aware of Hazel Whitmore for the last hour, not because she was beautiful, though she was, in a quiet way most men in this room lacked the sophistication to see. He had noticed her because of her stillness. In a room full of women performing for one another, she stood by the window like a woman trying to disappear. He had watched the way her fingers gripped the stem of her wine glass. He had watched the way she rehearsed her exit 3 separate times and did not take it. He had watched, and something in him had gone quiet in the way it only went quiet before he made a decision. Now he watched Preston lean in and whisper. He watched a single tear slide down Hazel's face. He watched Sienna laugh behind her hand. And Dario Castellano did something he had not done in a public restaurant in 7 years. He stood. The scrape of his chair was soft, but the Ashford room heard it the way a herd hears a lion breathing. The maitre d' at the entrance went pale. Marco, at his little table by the door, straightened his spine and let his hand drift toward the inside of his jacket. The jazz quartet, halfway through a Cole Porter standard, faltered on a single note. Two of the older diners, men who moved money for a living and knew exactly whose face they were seeing, set down their forks and did not pick them up again. Dario buttoned his suit jacket with one hand, a small gesture, so quiet it might have been mistaken for polite. It was not polite. It was a man deciding that someone was about to lose something. He crossed the walnut floor with the unhurried stride of a man who had never in his life needed to rush. He did not look at Preston. He did not look at Sienna. He walked directly to Hazel, stopped one respectful step away, and let the scent of sandalwood settle around her like a coat. "Signorina," Dario said, and his voice was low, rough, gentle in the way only truly dangerous men can be gentle. "Forgive me. I lost track of time. You must have thought I forgot our meeting." Hazel looked up at him, and for a moment her mind refused to translate what her eyes were seeing. She did not know this man. She had never met this man. And yet, this man was speaking to her, as though she were expected, as though she were important, as though the whole architecture of the evening had been quietly bending itself around her arrival, and she had simply failed to notice. Preston's face went through 3 colors in the span of one breath. He worked in finance. He knew the Castellano name. He knew it the way sailors know the name of a storm. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Dario turned his head, finally, and looked at Preston. He did not glare. He did not sneer. He simply looked, the way a surgeon looks at a tumor before deciding the cleanest angle. "I couldn't help but overhear," Dario said softly, "your assessment of a lady. I confess I found it educational." Now would be a very good time to hit subscribe, because what Dario Castellano is about to do to Preston Kane over the next 2 minutes is the kind of thing I promise you have never seen delivered so quietly. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss part 2. Trust me, you want to be there when this man's world starts burning. Preston tried to smile. The smile did not survive contact with Dario's face. "Mr. Castellano, I didn't realize we were just... You were just..." Dario let the 2 words hang between them like a blade. "Yes, I heard what you were just. Tell me your name." "Preston. Preston Kane." The name came out cracked. "Preston Kane." Dario repeated it slowly, as though committing it to a ledger he intended to close later. "And your firm?" "Whitfield Barrington." Preston swallowed. Sweat had begun to bead along his hairline. Sienna had gone completely silent beside him. Her manicured hand now clutched around her clutch as though it might save her. "Whitfield Barrington." Dario nodded once, thoughtfully, as though pleased with the answer. "I know your managing partner. Alan Whitfield and I once had dinner in this very room. Charming man. Terrible taste in employees, apparently, but charming." He allowed a small, cold smile to touch the corner of his mouth. "You called this woman fat, Mr. Kane. You called her embarrassing. You told her the dress she is wearing is crying for help." Dario turned his head slowly, and his dark eyes settled on Hazel, and something in them softened in a way that made her chest constrict. "I have been watching her for the better part of the evening, and I have to tell you, Mr. Kane, I disagree with your assessment on every possible count." Hazel could not breathe. She could not move. She could feel every eye in the Ashford room fixed on the 3 of them, and for the first time in her adult life, she was not the person shrinking under those eyes. Preston was. "She is," Dario continued, and now his voice was almost conversational, almost warm, "the most interesting woman in this room. Her posture is quiet. Her eyes are kind. She has been standing by that window for 1 hour and 17 minutes, and in that time, 3 men have looked at her and pretended not to. You called her fat. I call her the most interesting woman in this room. One of us has functioning eyes, Mr. Kane. The other, I suspect, should perhaps schedule an appointment." A woman 2 tables over let out a small, involuntary sound. A soft, delighted gasp. It broke something in the room. Sienna took a physical step backward, away from Preston, as though proximity itself had become dangerous. Preston opened his mouth to defend himself, to apologize, to say anything at all, And Dario raised one finger. Just one. And Preston closed his mouth. "You are going to leave now, Mr. Kane." Dario's voice had dropped to something even quieter, something meant only for Preston to fully hear. "You are going to collect your companion, and you are going to walk out of this restaurant, and you are not going to look back at this woman. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not ever. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Preston nodded. He could not speak. He nodded again, faster, as though the motion itself might save him. "Good." Dario stepped aside, just enough to let Preston pass. "Enjoy your evening, Mr. Kane. It will, I suspect, be the last quiet one you have for some time." Preston grabbed Sienna's elbow and moved toward the exit with the frantic, stumbling gait of a man trying not to run. Sienna's heel caught on the walnut floor. She did not look back. Neither did he. The maitre d' opened the door for them, and then the door closed, and the Ashford room exhaled. Dario turned back to Hazel. The lethal cold had already drained from his face, replaced by something quieter, something that felt disturbingly like curiosity. He inclined his head, just slightly, the way a European might greet a woman he did not yet know how to address. "Signorina Whitmore," he said, and Hazel realized with a small shock that he already knew her name. "May I buy you a proper glass of wine? The one you are holding has been trembling for the better part of an hour, and I suspect it is tired." Hazel Whitmore looked up into the dark eyes of the most dangerous man in Boston, and for the first time in 8 months, she did not feel small. She felt seen. "If you are still with me, and your heart is pounding the way mine was writing this, do me one favor before part 2 begins. Drop a red heart in the comments, and tell me the exact moment Dario stood up. That is the moment this whole story turned. And what happens next, when Hazel finally opens her mouth and reveals what she has been hiding her whole life, is going to change everything Dario Castellano thought he understood about the woman he just offended. Part 2 is coming. Hazel accepted the glass of Barolo he offered because refusing felt impossible, and because her hands needed something to hold that was not shaking. Dario Castellano did not sit at her table. He did not presume. He stood a respectful distance away, one hand in the pocket of his charcoal trousers, and waited for her to speak first. That, more than anything else, was what undid her. Preston had never waited for her to speak first in 3 years. Preston had filled every silence with the sound of his own voice. This man who had just publicly dismantled her ex-fiancé with the surgical calm of a man ordering coffee, was standing in front of her in complete stillness, as though her next words were the only thing in the room worth hearing. "Thank you." Her voice came out rougher than she wanted. "I don't know why you did that, but thank you. You do not have to know why." Dario's dark eyes moved across her face slowly, cataloging her the way a man catalogs something he intends to remember. "You only have to accept that it is done." She almost laughed. She did not quite manage it. "Men like you don't do things like that for women like me without a reason, Mr. Castellano." His eyebrow lifted, just slightly. "Men like me." He tasted the phrase. "And what, Signorina Whitmore, do you imagine men like me to be?" The Barolo warmed her throat. It gave her enough courage to look directly at him, which she had not yet done. Dangerous. Watched. Written about in the kind of newspapers my father used to read out loud at breakfast when he wanted to warn me about the world. She held his gaze. "You are Dario Castellano. Everyone in Boston knows what that name means. I may be a woman in a borrowed dress, but I am not naive." Something shifted in his face. It was not quite a smile. It was the ghost of one. "No," he said quietly. "No, I can see that you are not." He tilted his head very slightly, the way a man tilts his head when a puzzle in front of him has just rearranged itself. "Tell me, where did a junior architect from Vermont learn to look a man like me in the eye without flinching?" She almost dropped her glass. He knew she was from Vermont. He knew she was a junior architect. He had known her name before he approached her table. She realized, with a slow, cold clarity, that Dario Castellano had not chosen her at random tonight. He had been watching her for a reason. Whether that reason was benign or something else entirely, she could not yet tell. "You looked me up." Her voice was flat. "I asked one question of the maitre d' when I arrived." He did not deny it. He did not soften it. I asked who the woman by the window was. He told me your name and your firm. Everything else, I learned by watching you for an hour and 17 minutes. He paused. You do not perform for this room, Signorina Whitmore. That is rare. In my experience, rare things are worth understanding. Across the walnut floor, Marco had risen quietly from his little table by the door and was making his way over with the discretion of a man who had done this 1,000 times. He murmured something in his boss's ear, low enough that Hazel caught only 3 words, and 2 of those words were Italian. Without thinking, without even choosing to, Hazel answered in the language of her grandmother. Non è necessario. Sto bene. It is not necessary. I am fine. The words came out of her mouth in the soft, rounded vowels of Tuscany, in the specific cadence of old Florence, in the exact accent Nonna Beatrice had beaten into her every summer of her childhood with a wooden spoon and a great deal of love. And Dario Castellano, who had heard perhaps 200 women speak Italian in his lifetime, went absolutely, completely still. Marco stopped mid-sentence. His eyes flicked to his boss. His boss did not look at him. His boss was looking at Hazel Whitmore as though the floor had just tilted underneath him. Firenze, Dario said softly. Florence. It was not a question. Mia nonna, Hazel answered. My grandmother. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, and she did not know why she had spoken. Perhaps because she was tired of hiding. Perhaps because the wine was warm and this man was too observant, and she wanted, just once in her life, to be seen for the whole of what she was. Agni estate, fino ai 18 anni. Every summer, until I was 18. Now stop for 1 second. If you are still with me, and if your jaw is on the floor the way I want it to be, drop the word Firenze in the comments. Because what just happened is the exact moment the Mafia king realized the woman he defended out of pity is actually a woman he has been waiting his whole life to meet. Hit that like button and keep watching. This is where the story stops being about revenge and starts being about something much more dangerous. Dario dismissed Marco with a small motion of 2 fingers. Marco returned to his table without a word. And Dario, for the first time since he had risen from his chair, sat down. He pulled out the chair opposite Hazel with quiet deliberation, and he sat and he looked at her across the small round table, as though she were the only human being left in the room. Tell me about her, he said. In English now. Gentler. Your grandmother. And Hazel, who had not spoken about Nonna Beatrice to another living soul in 6 years, opened her mouth and told him. She told him about the stone villa outside Florence with a cracked terracotta roof. She told him about the piano lessons her mother had taken as a girl in the conservatory. The same conservatory where Nana had once been a soprano before her voice cracked at 40 and she retreated to the countryside to raise her daughter alone. She told him about the summers of forbidden English, the wooden spoon, the smell of basil and old books, the way her grandmother had made her recite Dante on the terrace at dusk until the fireflies came out. She told him her mother was dead now, had been dead for 11 years. She told him her father was sick, and the illness had a slow and cruel name, and she was drowning quietly under the weight of what his care cost. She had not meant to tell him any of it. It came out of her the way blood comes out of a wound that has been held closed for too long. Dario listened. He did not interrupt. He did not perform sympathy. He did not reach across the table to touch her hand, though she saw him consider it. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, and then he said the only correct thing. Thank you for telling me. She wiped her cheek. She had not realized she was crying again. I don't know why I did. Because you have been carrying it alone for a very long time. His voice was low, and tonight someone finally sat still enough to hold the other end of it. She looked at him. She saw a man whose hands had almost certainly done terrible things. She saw a man whose name was whispered in rooms she would never be invited into. She also saw a man who had heard a cruel word spoken to a stranger and had risen from his chair without hesitation. And she understood, with a clarity that only exhaustion brings, that these 2 men were not separate. They were the same man, and she did not yet know what to do with that. I should go home, she said quietly. My driver will take you. He said it as a fact, not an offer. And I would like, if you will permit it, to see you again. In daylight. Somewhere quiet. Where you do not have to be brave. She almost said no. She almost thanked him and disappeared into the rest of her small, tired life. Instead, she nodded once. And Dario Castellano, without smiling, did something she would remember for a very long time. He removed his charcoal suit jacket, walked around the table, and draped it gently across her shoulders. It was warm. It smelled of sandalwood and something older, something like leather and cold stone. He did not linger. He did not touch her skin. He simply covered her, the way a man covers something he has already decided to protect. She wore his jacket all the way home in the back of a black armored SUV, and she did not take it off even when she was alone in her small apartment in Cambridge, sitting on the edge of her bed at 2 in the morning, staring at her reflection in the dark window. She looked at the woman in the borrowed navy dress, wrapped in a Mafia king's jacket, and for the first time in 8 months, she did not hate what she saw. Preston Kane did not sleep that night. He did not sleep the next night either. At 6 in the morning, roughly 9 hours after Dario Castellano had told him his quiet evenings were over, Preston's phone buzzed with a calendar notification he had not created. A meeting had been added to his schedule at 8:30 a.m. with Alan Whitfield, managing partner. Location, the corner office. Subject line, blank. Preston stared at his phone in the dark of his Back Bay apartment and felt something cold move through his chest. By 9:15, his keycard no longer opened the elevator to the 32nd floor. By 9:40, an encrypted email had been forwarded to compliance detailing 3 years of quiet regulatory violations Preston had helped a particular client obscure. By 11, Alan Whitfield, a charming man with terrible taste in employees, was explaining to Preston across a mahogany desk that Whitfield Barrington would not be requiring his services any further, and that any attempt to contest the termination would result in the compliance file being forwarded to the SEC rather than quietly buried in the firm's own legal department. Preston tried to argue. Alan Whitfield looked at him the way a man looks at a dog that has soiled the rug, and did not respond. Security escorted Preston to the elevator. His personal belongings were couriered to his apartment by 2 that afternoon in a single cardboard box. By 3, Sienna's Instagram sponsorships had begun to evaporate. A protein powder brand that had paid her $12,000 a month suddenly declined to renew. An Athlete Is Your Company canceled a scheduled shoot. Her manager stopped returning calls. Every brand Sienna had ever worked with was, it turned out, connected somewhere upstream to a holding company whose ultimate ownership traced back to a shipping concern in the port of Boston. Sienna, who had never in her life been required to think about where her money came from, discovered at 4 in the afternoon that all of it had come from the same place, and that place had closed its door to her. She was gone from Preston's apartment by 7. She left a single voicemail. It was not kind. By 10 p.m., Preston's landlord, an LLC he had never bothered to look up, had served notice of a lease violation, citing 3 noise complaints that had never been filed and 1 clause of the lease Preston had never read. He had 30 days to vacate. By midnight, his father in Greenwich had received cancellation calls from 3 major investors in a mid-sized real estate development that had been the family's largest project of the year. Preston's father called him at 12:40. The conversation was short. It ended with Preston being told, in a voice he had never heard his father use, that he was no longer welcome at the house in Connecticut until the family could assess how much damage his behavior had caused. Preston sat alone in his half-empty apartment at 2 in the morning, staring at a cold takeout container, refreshing his email, and watching his professional network go silent 1 contact at a time. He had never in his life been alone in the way he was alone that night. He did not yet fully understand what had happened to him. He would eventually, but by then it would be far too late. If you are enjoying watching this man's life turn to ash, and I know you are, do not forget to subscribe. Because part 3 of this saga, and yes, there is a part 3, is where Hazel walks back into a room with Preston in it, and what she says to him is the single most satisfying line I have ever written for a woman in her position. Turn on the bell. You do not want to miss it. 6 weeks later, Hazel Whitmore stood on the terrace of a brownstone in Beacon Hill, watching the first snow of December settle on the wrought iron railing. She was not the same woman who had stood by the window of the Ashford room in a borrowed dress. She wore a deep burgundy velvet gown that had been cut for her body by a tailor in the North End whose bill Dario had refused to let her see. Her chestnut hair fell loose around her shoulders. Her father was 3 weeks into a new treatment protocol at Mass General that had already given him back the use of his right hand, and the bill for that treatment had simply, quietly, disappeared from her online patient portal. She had not asked how. Dario had not offered. Some gifts, she had learned, were given the way this man did everything, without noise and without expectation. She had resigned from Halloway and Reed 2 weeks earlier. She was now the lead interior architect on a redesign of the entire Castellano restaurant chain across New England, a legitimate contract signed with a legitimate holding company for a legitimate fee that was, when she first saw the number, larger than everything she had earned in the previous 3 years combined. The work was real. The work was hers. She had earned the contract on her portfolio, not on her proximity to the man who had offered it. And Dario had made a specific point of having the offer vetted by a third party, precisely, so she would never have to wonder. They were not, yet, officially, together. He walked her home every evening. He kissed her hand at her door. He had not once crossed the threshold of her apartment, and he had not once asked to. She was slowly realizing, courting her in a language older than the century they lived in, and she was slowly allowing herself to be courted. Preston Kane had tried, twice, to reach her. The first time, 3 weeks after that night, he had sent a long email full of apologies and self-pity and requests. She had read 3 lines and deleted it. The second time, he had shown up outside her apartment building in Cambridge at 9 on a Tuesday evening, unshaven and thinner than she remembered, and he had begged her to call Dario off. He said the O'Connor family, whose money he had helped move for 6 years, had begun asking questions he could not answer. He said he was afraid. He said he was sorry. He said he had been wrong about everything, about her body, about her worth. He said he loved her. She had listened. She had not interrupted. And when he was finished, she had said one thing, quietly, and it had been the only thing she had wanted to say to him for 3 years. Preston, look at where I am. Look at where you are. You told me once that it was embarrassing to be seen with me. You were right that one of us was always going to be embarrassing to be seen with. You just had the wrong person in mind. Then she had walked into her building and closed the door. She had not seen him since. She did not expect to see him again. What became of him after that was not, she had decided, her concern. She had spent enough of her life carrying the weight of men who had never once carried hers. Dario stepped onto the terrace behind her now, carrying 2 glasses of Barolo. He had not spoken. He rarely spoke first. He handed her 1 glass, and he stood beside her at the wrought iron railing, and they watched the snow together in a silence that was, she had come to understand, its own language. My father wants to meet you. She said it quietly, into the cold air. He asked me yesterday. He wants to know the name of the man who paid for his treatment. Dario did not turn his head. And what did you tell him? I told him your name is Dario. I told him you are a businessman. I told him you were the first man in a very long time who looked at me and saw me. She paused. I did not tell him the rest. Do you want to tell him the rest? Not yet. She turned to look at him. His profile was sharp against the snow-lit dark. Someday, when I know how the story ends. He turned then, and he looked down at her, and his dark eyes were quieter than she had ever seen them. Signorina Whitmore, he said softly, I do not know how the story ends either. I know only that I intend to be standing beside you when it does. She reached up. She touched the faint scar along his jaw with the tip of 1 finger. He did not flinch. He did not move. He simply let her touch him, the way a man lets himself be touched who has not been touched gently in a very long time. Then stand beside me, she said. And Dario Castellano, the most feared man in Boston, closed his eyes. The snow kept falling. Somewhere across the city, Preston Kane was learning what it meant to be forgotten by the world that had once celebrated him. Somewhere in Vermont, an old professor was holding a pen steady for the first time in a year. And on a terrace in Beacon Hill, A woman in a burgundy velvet gown who had spent her whole life being told she was too much finally understood that she had never been too much. She had only ever been surrounded by men too small to hold her. She was not too much for this man. This man had risen from his chair to prove it. If this story moved you, if Hazel's ending felt like a wound finally closing, do the 3 things that matter. Hit that like button until it turns blue. Drop a comment telling me the exact line that broke you, because I read every single one. And subscribe with the bell turned on, because next week I am telling you the story of a widowed nurse who was humiliated at her own husband's funeral by his family, until a silent stranger in the back pew stood up and revealed a secret that changed the reading of the will forever. You do not want to miss it. I will see you there.